So welcome to a episode of Passing on Faith, this podcast. I am Pastor Rochelle Webster, sometimes also called Shelley by family and friends, and probably in this conversation because I have with me Professor John Webster, who also happens to be my father. And as we have...
Otherwise known as Dad.
Otherwise known as Dad, so you'll hear that as well. So, Dad, I am grateful that you're willing to be part of this conversation and these kind of series of conversations that we're going to have. And as I've mentioned on the previous podcast with Grandpa, what I'm hoping to do is just to have some conversations around this passing on faith topic, and that the passing on faith can be either the questions around what it means to share our faith, and also conversation around why people pass on faith and say, no, that's not for me. Yeah, and to start, I just thought maybe we'd ask some brief biographical questions about what life was like for you growing up before you were 18. Just paint a picture of that time period for any listeners here who might be under 18 right now and trying to imagine a different world.
Now, the world has changed, particularly, I suppose, start right where we are right now. This would have been impossible to have a Zoom connection via the internet. But interestingly enough, in many substantive ways, it's much the same. I mean, I was born just before the space age began, grew up with that happening, grew up with the moon landing, which happened while I was on a train going back from school to where my parents were on a 3-day train trip, listening to a portable radio to try to catch the event. The world has changed in many ways, but in some ways, much is the same. Maybe can I say a word about how the church has changed, perhaps?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I grew up in a loving family of warm, Christ-centered individuals. I think you've had a chance to hear my father, who's in his 90s. I'm grateful for that. But the church was, obviously in a different continent. It was a very conservative environment. I do remember, I never had an experience of rebellion as such, but I do remember chafing and wondering why the church did certain things, as I said, rather conservative. I remember one thing standing out when my mother was teaching at a local high school. My father was the pastor of the church. And just down the road was a brand new thing called the Cinerama. And this was a sort of, the latest and best in terms of cinema. And they were showing a movie that I desperately wanted to see called The Battle of Britain. I still, by the way, to this day, have not seen that movie. I really wanted to do it, but, this was just a line too far. We just didn't do that in those days. So I remember that. And then I do remember the first time that my mother actually was willing to take me to see a Cliff Richard movie called To a Penny. It was a Christian movie, and it was not in the theater, but it was in a hall. But the ability to go there and see that, I think the willingness of my mother to understand and to see the positives in that, I think were critically important to me. So I really responded to the present truth dimension in Adventism, and the sense that while the truth does not change, God does not change, yet our understanding of it does, and that's a good thing. Asking questions is not bad; it's a good thing.
So you've started describing it, but I'm curious about the Adventist faith community, the parts of it that you really loved that kept you connected with the Adventist faith tradition and community, and the parts that were challenging for you that might maybe have caused some of your peers to have moved away from the Adventist community, and if you've seen some shifts in that as well, or hope for some shifts in that.
I mean, I think the great strength is a tremendous sense of community and identity. I belong to an extended family. I did find in my own family the strong sense of acceptance, almost unconditional. I mean, only God loves us unconditionally, but a close approximation. I think that was really vital, so that I had space to ask questions, to object to some features. And by allowing that, the net product for me was that I was able to do the essential sifting. And, you know, God does not have, they put it, God does not have grandchildren, only children. So you can't just hand this down unchanged. And I had an immediate family that allowed me to ask these questions and not see it as a sign of rebellion, but see it as a sign of ownership, of acquiring something. And so there were aspects of the Adventism of the day that I questioned and have indeed changed over the times. I mean, precisely the things I was worrying about and finding unhelpful back then have been things that have changed just gradually. And in a helpful way. But because I was allowed to think and encouraged to ask questions, never judged for doing that, I think I had a safe space in which to maintain the loyalty to God and to faith, and realize that it changes over time and that we are responsible for the direction of that change. It's not, you know, there's nothing given that it's going to survive. There's nothing given that it's going to be handed down from each generation in a way that's better, but that's what our responsibility is.
Yeah, I resonate with it, Dad. And to give you and Mom credit, you very much did the same thing for me and for all of us growing up. There was this space to have curiosity about how our Adventist faith made sense in a changing world, in a consistently changing world. You know, what parts spoke to us differently than it might even have spoken to you, or definitely spoke to Grandpa, and what parts held constant, right?
Now, to say a little more about the passing of the faith, or passing on faith. Passing on the faith. It's partly, I think, that I have been in a fortunate position, because my day job, what I'm paid to do, is to love the church, to love Jesus that the church attempts to point to, and to think long and hard about what we say about God, what we say about the gospel, what we say about the Adventist faith, and to try to, in a little way, help our witness to be a little better, a little sharper, a little more relevant. And I think that is enormously beneficial to me. There's a famous architect, actually. Somebody may have heard of him. He actually wrote a book called A Pattern Language, which became very influential, not only in architecture. He is the first person to receive a PhD in architecture from Harvard. He had a background in physics, became a professor emeritus at UC Berkeley in architecture. Very interesting and controversial figure, Christopher Alexander. And he spent a whole lifetime trying to wonder, what is life? And in his magnum opus was The Nature of Order. What is the signature of something when it's living, when it's alive, and when it's beneficial? And he came up with an earlier phrase and then a later phrase: structure preserving transformations. Later on, wholeness preserving transformation. The essence of life is change. If all change stops, you reach 0 degrees Kelvin and it's nothing. You know, even subatomic particles can't operate. So unlike the ancient world, which saw change as inevitably decay, part of the signature of modern understanding is that life is change. And yet Christopher Alexander knew that if you change too much, you rupture identity. And so finding structure preserving or wholeness preserving transformation is, I think, a very profound way of thinking about passing on the faith. So I feel privileged and I feel blessed by being able to be at that fulcrum, at that nexus between transmitting something that is valuable from the past and making sure that it's relevant in the present and that it continues. One more thing about that.
And I'll just make a quick note here, because I did an introduction of you as my father, but you also are a professor of systematic theology at a school nearby at La Sierra University. So just for those listening who might not know, your field is in the field of theology. And
right. And I teach people who are going to become pastors, as well as those going on for other academic studies. Yeah.
Right.
Now, thank you, Shelley. So the other thing I'd like to say is this, that, you know, I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding of what faith is, passing on the faith. We could think of it like a wrapped up present, right? A box of goodies. And sorry?
I'm going to push back on you, because you're saying passing on the faith, and this podcast is called Passing on Faith. And I think this is an important distinction.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Exactly the distinction, yeah.
To think that it's just a box with a given set of ingredients and you just are there to look after it custodially and hand it on is, I think, a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Because really faith is faith in God. Right. And really God has self-disclosed God's self to us in Jesus. So really everything that we think of in terms of doctrines or lifestyle is to be able to witness or point to Jesus.
Yeah.
And so, the gospel, God and God's self-disclosure does not change. That is eternal and will never change. And then we can have confidence in that. But our expression, our understanding, and our passing it on will it can always be improved. And that's been really helpful to me. And it gives me a sort of sense of a kind of security that comes from trust. I know in whom I have believed. Jesus said, you read the Bible, but it's the scriptures that testify of me. Right. That's very powerful to me, that it is pointing to Jesus. And yet I know my own weakness. I'm, just a human being. I could be mistaken. And that's why all of us together as a community have a responsibility for passing on faith. And in that passing on, there's going to be some change and some continuity. And we should never feel that if things are changing, that it's necessarily changing for the worse. It has to change from generation to generation. And yet our hearts should be full of joy when we see it being appropriated and taken, when the next generation takes responsibility for thinking and reworking.
Yeah, boy, as always, Dad, we can have long conversations and have had many long conversations. But I'm trying to keep these little snippets just short enough for people to hear on their way to work or in the mornings. Right. But I did want to, and we'll continue as we go through this series, but I did just want to ask, what might you say to those in your age bracket who may have children or grandchildren who have passed or said, yeah, I'm passing on faith, at least faith the way that you or our listeners understood it. Do you have any words for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first really important thing to do is not to panic and to listen, right? Is to hear what is going on in our kids or in another generation, and try to hear what they're saying. But sometimes it's Christians acting badly that is the reason why the next generation wants to pass on faith. And we need to hear. Sometimes it needs to acknowledge, confess. And I think our kids and our grandkids and our next generation within our church community will actually respond better if they see us humble, open to correction, wanting to hear them, and genuinely engaged in that process rather than just abandoning them.
As we said, this is a little bit of a peek into my life. We've had lots of conversations like this around dinner tables growing up, and family gatherings. And as you know, I get to talk to Ember too about some of these, and hopefully,
this is a precious moment that may not last. To have, my parents still alive in their 90s,
You in your 60s and me in my 30s.
That was a secret.
No,
right,
not a secret. I'm telling
you in your 30s,
and
Amber you know, the other siblings, and then having another generation that is now reaching the point where you can have serious conversations about this. I'm glad you're talking to my eldest granddaughter, which is Amber.
Yeah. So thank you. I look forward to just continuing having a conversation. As I've mentioned to our listeners, we just kind of jumped in, but we just thought it might be helpful to have a conversation and invite you in with us. So we thank you for those who are listening. I thank you, Dad, for having this conversation, and we will connect next time.
Thank you very much, Pastor Rochelle. Blessings in your ministry.
Bye-bye. And we've come to the end of another episode. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you join us next time as we continue the conversation with my niece, Amber, who is a teenager curious about questions of God and faith and life. I am very excited about our conversation. Until then, be blessed, and we hope you join us next time.